Today well, first of all, I'd like to thank the organisers, Kai and Anil, very much for allowing me to speak today. I'd like to tell you about some recent work I've been doing looking at things called Scatternets, which are a new technique that has been proposed predominantly by Stéphane Mallat of Wavelet fame as front ends for deep networks. Some of what I have to say will be tutorial, and for those of you who know all about it, I apologise. Other bits of this talk will be about specific new work that we've been doing, in particular how we use dual-tree wavelets to implement Scatternets, and also how we've modified the visualization methods of Zeiler and Fergus to also apply through a Scatternet front end. So this is a brief outline of the talk, which I won't bother to go through. So the acknowledgements are the work of Stéphane Mallat, Joan Brunner, and Laurent Siffre, done in École Polytechnique in Paris, and also ideas from my collaborator on this work, Anton van den Hengel from the University of Adelaide in Australia. The key papers by Mallat and co. are Brunner and Mallat, Transactions on PAMI from 2013, and Siffre and Mallat at CVPR 2013. The ideas I'll be talking about to do with deep networks and for visualizing them via an inverse deep network are due to Matthew Zeiler and Rob Fergus from the Courant Institute in New York. And they're these two papers. Basically, as we've heard already, deep nets comprise a number of layers of convolutional processing separated by nonlinear pooling operations. And usually the basic idea is that these layers should provide progressively increased sparsity of representation and sort of selectivity. And it has been postulated and to some extent shown that there are strong similarities to the processing found in the early stages of human vision. What are Scatternets? They're cascades of predefined linear filters, which are typically wavelet transforms, and nonlinear operators, which can be the ReLU, but more advantageously can be the complex modulus operator, which takes the magnitude of a complex number. And these can be applied over several layers to provide relatively high order, rich descriptors of a signal at the front end of a vision system. I always liken it to the fact that most people who deal with audio processing wouldn't dream of processing the original audio waveform. The first thing they do is do a spectrum analysis, a running spectrum analysis versus time of the waveform, and analyze it as a two-dimensional evolving structure. In the same way, we're proposing that if you've got images, you don't start processing just the pixels, you instead put the pixels through a wavelet-based front end, which brings out various features, both first order and higher order ways to describe the patterns of pixels in relatively well-defined ways. When we have classifiers, we usually like to make them insensitive to shifts and lighting changes and deformation. It's what the earlier talk was all about when he was rotating all the Plankton and Galaxies and things. The aim is to make your system insensitive to these variabilities that one normally finds in images, but at the same time preserve information about how sharp edges are, fine structures, things like that, in order to get good discrimination between the classes. This is an example of AlexNet, published in 2012 from Krzyzewski, Skaver and Hinton. Sorry, the diagrams got chopped off at the top. It was like that in the original paper. So this is taken direct from Alex Krzyzewski's paper. So I'm assuming you're all familiar with a typical network like this. There are numerous other ones that have been proposed more recently that have minor modifications. The main take-home message of these is that they start with an image that's perhaps 224 square, and immediately they come down to a set of sort of sub-image planes that are only 55 square, about a quarter of the size, and then they further come down to 27 square planes, and finally 13. So there's various stages of decimation by either 4 or 2, sometimes by 3 in systems, and as part of these decimations we do max pooling over a local region. A scattering network looks like this. I shall explain it in a bit more detail a little later on in the talk, but basically what we have here is a wavelet transform front end where we have an input image of size 256 by 256, for example, and then we have 4 layers, 4 scales of wavelet processing, and from each scale we get, in the case of the dual tree wavelet transform, 6 bandpass outputs. In the case of a conventional fully decimated wavelet transform, we get 3 bandpass outputs, a high-low, low-high, high-high. I'll show you what the 6 ones are in a minute. They're more orientation selective. But we get 6, and we get that at each of 4 different scales, producing subbands, first of all, of half the resolution of the input image, then a quarter, then an eighth, and then a 16th of the input resolution. So this is our linear filtering processing. That is then followed by nonlinearity, which Stéphane Malin suggested should be a complex modulus. I agree with him, and this is like a super souped-up ReLU, if you like. Then having created a number of subband images, if you like, coming out of the complex modulus, we effectively get 6 images for 6 different orientations at each of these 4 scales. We then apply wavelet transforms to every one of those images. So we apply 6 wavelet transforms at this resolution, another 6 at this resolution, and so on. And the depth of the wavelet transform is appropriate to the resolution of its input. So we get this is the second stage of wavelet transforms that effectively makes this a higher order spectral system. Those of you familiar with spectral analysis will know there's first order spectrum and then there are higher order spectra. This is effectively the equivalent of a second order spectrum description of the signal. And we again follow these by modulus operators. The modulus operators are great because they actually give you some shift invariance in the system. When you, with complex wavelets, if you shift the input around, you get complex wavelet coefficients whose magnitude tends to stay the same, but whose phase rotates. So this effectively ignores the phase rotation that is highly dependent on shift, and just takes the magnitude, which is somewhat independent of shift, these small local shifts. And you then do the same here, and these are all at lower rates, so you get a bigger amount of shift invariance in later stages. This is what the decimation and max pooling operations in a convolutional net achieve as well. The max pooling effectively gives you local invariance to shift in the same way as these magnitude operations do. So the desirable properties, which were outlined by Sifra and Malin in the 2013 CVPR paper, are that the early layers should provide invariance to shift, rotation, dilation, and modest nonlinear deformation. This is small amounts of local shift and rotation and things. The later layers then form a coarsely sampled rich descriptor space that can then more easily distinguish between different types of object and classes. More easily, that is, than the original pixels can. He defines operators like convolutions and pooling, should ideally be invariant or covariant to a set of deformations, curly G. So if an operator is in the set curly G, and little g is an example of that, is invariant to this set, then what that means is that when we apply the operator R on G of X, that's the same as applying the operator on just X. So in other words, the operator on a shifted version of the image should be the same as the operator on the original image. Something like taking the magnitude of Fourier coefficients is an example of this. Covariant to the operator occurs when you have the operator applied to Gx is now equivalent to applying the operator on Rx. Convolution is an example of that. If you shift the input to a filter around, then the output from the filter also shifts around. So the shift gets sort of transferred through the filtering operation. So convolutions are covariant to shifts. Pooling operations, such as max, as long as you stay within the range of the max, are invariant to shifts, because when you shift the input to a max operator around, you don't alter where the max, at least you don't alter what the max is. Full invariance to definitions is not desirable because it can allow one image to be deformed completely into another, such as digits. Malat went on to talk about Lipschitz continuity. I won't go into that now, but we can show that the sort of band-limited nature of wavelets gives us an element of Lipschitz continuity. The Fourier modulus operator is invariant to shifts, but it's unstable. In other words, it's not Lipschitz continuous with respect to deformation, so that a small amount of dilation of an image can make a big difference to individual Fourier coefficients if there are high frequencies present in the image. It effectively shifts the position of the Fourier coefficients, which means individual ones change a lot. And so that Fourier transform is not a suitable operator for doing object recognition and classification. Wavelets are highly localized, but they are stable to deformations. The smaller the deformation, the smaller the change to the wavelet coefficient. And these analytic complex wavelet coefficients, which I referred to just now, have this property that the phase changes linearly with shift, small local displacements, and the magnitude is invariant. And the scattering network builds on the nonlinear invariance from the complex wavelet filters by taking the complex modulus or wavelet modulus, which is the square root of real part squared plus imaginary part squared. And this is known as curly W. We can design wavelet transforms, in particular complex ones, to be tight frames. There's redundancy there, and they preserve energy from the spatial domain into the wavelet domain. If we take the modulus of a complex number, we also preserve its energy. So the whole nonlinear, the filtering plus nonlinear wavelet modulus is an energy-preserving operation. And what this means, and this was pointed out by Malat, was it produces a highly stable system with respect to noise and small deformations, and it helps to ensure Lipschitz continuity, which is that the error should tend to zero as the deformation tends to zero smoothly. And it's important to realize that the modulus of an analytic signal efficiently achieves the effect of doing a ReLU and max pooling over many fine shifts of the data. You've got a bandpass signal, and you want to decide on the amplitude of the underlying sinusoid, but you want to be independent of any shifts in that. Then what you do is you look at a whole load of shifted outputs, and you take the max of the rectified output, and that tells you the magnitude of the underlying sine wave. Alternatively, if you've got the 90-degree phase shifted version of that signal, the Hilbert pair of it, you just take you'd regard it as real and imaginary parts of a complex waveform, and just take the complex magnitude, which is much more efficient. You only need two inputs, two sets of filters to do this, rather than a whole set of outputs at finely spaced points. This is an example of the Morley wavelet. It was one of the original complex wavelets from the 1980s that Bruna and Mala used. This is its frequency response in 2D frequency space. These are the waveforms. That should be a circle, by the way. The projectors have gone a bit funny. So these are what Mala uses. These are what I use, which are dual tree wavelets, which is something I've been developing for the last 15 years or so. The typical wavelets look like this. We have real and imaginary parts from the red and the blue. These are one-dimensional wavelets, and when we combine these real and imaginary parts, which form sort of complex, modulated complex exponentials, if you combine that horizontally and vertically, the fact that you've got pure modulated exponentials here means that we only get a single wave in the output. So we get we get 6 oriented filters, and these are the real and the imaginary parts. This contrasts against a real wavelet transform, which tends to produce these basis functions in 2D, and this one is very annoying because it's just a checkerboard, and very few real objects have checkerboard features, whereas lots of real objects have oriented edges with all sorts of different orientations, which is what these filters pick out. So if we just see very briefly what is picked up by these, and well-known linear image, we use a color palette for the complex coefficients. So these are our 6 orientation of filters: the fine scale, next second scale, third scale, fourth scale, so this is what you should visualize when you see this. That box there is producing all these 4 scales of sets of 6 images, plus a low-pass image coming out at the bottom of the box here. So that's how to read this diagram. If we talk about avoiding information loss as we go through the early stages of this network, a type frame wavelet transform is lossless because it's perfectly invertible. Got perfect reconstruction capabilities, in other words. The modulus operator appears to be lossy because we're throwing away phase information. But, in fact, Mala has shown for a number of years that redundant transforms like the complex Morley one or the dual tree waveform, the dual tree wavelet transform, the original signal can be restored from just the modulus of the wavelet coefficients. In practice, therefore, this operator is not lossy either. The action of averaging or smoothing a wavelet modulus is lossy because the higher frequencies get removed, but we can overcome that by combining our averaging operation, which is giving us the shift invariance, with the bandpass outputs of a wavelet transform that retain the high frequencies, and then we take the modulus of those in order to give them some shift invariance as well. So they tell us effectively how much energy at each orientation there is they don't tell us precisely where it is. So by adding the Wavelet Transforms, the second layer, we can, the next layer, we can effectively do some averaging in the low-pass part of the Wavelet Transform and preserve the high frequencies. And as I say, we make that deformation invariant. So these transforms here are the ones that are effectively, in passing from here through to these low-pass outputs, here, here, and here, and also the smoothing here, we actually achieve some averaging of the modulus, which is equivalent to max pooling, but we also keep the high frequencies, and we take the modulus of them in order to see how much detail is present in a relatively shift invariant way. There is a problem with this one, and that is that you get outputs at all different resolutions if you're not careful, because of all these different image sizes here and also here. But we can make a multi-scale version of this. We observe that in fact this box A is actually formed from a one-layer wavelet with a low-pass output feeding into another wavelet here with a low-pass output and another one here and another one here, and similarly for the B and C and E boxes, and that's what we see here. Here's the A box split across a number of different layers according to the resolution. So this is now much more consistent with the way a convolutional net works. The B one starts at scale 2, the A one starts at scale 1, so we've got A1 to 4, B starts at scale 2, so we've got B2 to 4, C starts at scale 3, looking at the output of this box, we've got C3 and 4, and finally E starts here and gives us this one. D is a sort of third order processing of the outputs of this B2 layer, and H is in fact a fourth order processing, if you want to keep it, which is the processing of the outputs of the third order D3. So this is a sort of fairly brand new way of describing wavelet Scatternets, such that the resolution of everything at each vertical dotted lines is basically the same as you go through the next. You halve it each time. The number of coefficients goes up. In fact, this is 10 coefficients for every 2x2 block of Pels. This is 70 for every 4x4 block. This is 490 for every 8x8 block. And this is 3,430 for every 16x16 block. The redundancy actually goes up by a factor of 7/4 at each time, so it's not a vast amount. The other beautiful thing you can do is you can start by measuring the energy of your input image and call it 100%, and then you can measure the energies all the rest of the way through the network, and these are in red, and you find that 98.6 comes through this path, of which 95.5 is there and 3.1 here, 1.2% of this 1.4, 1.22 is there and only 0.218 is here. So these percentages are all of the original input energy. So this sort of demonstrates the energy conservation properties of the whole network, which is rather beautiful and something you don't get with CNNs. Now we want to see whether the Scatternet front end produces things that are similar to a wavelet. This is what Seiler and Fergus have achieved. They showed, for example, that if you reprojected just back through layer 1, you could get these very small features. Through layer 2, these features, layer 3, here, and so on. This is from a standard CNN. This is how they did it. They this is actually the forward part of the convolutional net. going from one layer up through feature maps, which are the filters, then rectifying and pooling, that we could actually go back down over this side. Don't quite know why they drew it on the left. There we go. As long as you feed across the information about which things produced the max output. And if given a given max, you can then put it back in the correct place and then pass it back through the filters of that layer. And sort of matched filter theory says that what you get out of the thing is then the component of the input that excites those particular filters. I won't go through that. We've seen that image. Visualization of a Scatternet system. Well, we've developed this multi-scale one, which is what I've just been showing you. The pooling operation, the key thing here is that rather than storing the switches of your max operator in order to invert the operation, when we invert the magnitude or modulus operation for the complex wavelets, all we have to do is reinsert the phase that was ignored by the modulus. So as long as we store the phases from when we did the forward pass, we can pop those back in and actually recreate the signal that created that. And so that is actually a much nicer thing to do, and it loses much less information when you go back. So using this trick of reinserting the phases when you do the deconvolution actually means we get some very nice looking images. So for this being the network, this is how the network basically splits the thing. This is a slightly blurred version of the image. We can see that there are actually some detail in these images here. You can just about see that. There's effectively, this is what happens in the B2 Wavelet Transform. This is the A2 one. So you can see we get a lot of different versions of the input. These are the high orders. We can then go on. This is the same third layer, and then it goes into fourth layer filters here. Again, I won't really do that. What I do want to show you is this one, which shows you what you get through the Scatternet when you effectively measure the activity of the Scatternet coefficients and then just pick the largest relatively small proportion. These are all fairly sparse masks, and these are what you get back out of the deconvolution through the Scatternet layers of your system. So I want to jump on now just to complete the summary and answer the question that I posed at the title of the talk. The disadvantages of Scaternets are that the net is predefined, so it may not match the training data as effectively as trained earlier layers would do. And the Scatternet may introduce unwanted redundancy in representing this input data. But the advantages of Scaternets, first of all, are that they are predefined, and they're based on our knowledge of the requirements for vision understanding and the characteristics of human and mammalian vision. So features such as translation, rotation, scaling variance can be designed in rather than just having to be learnt. So we don't have to do all this rotation of images and things. We just design this in. The stability of the early Scatternet layers, because they're predefined, means the later network layers can all, in theory, learn much more quickly, using larger gains for their weight updates, and without the learning process becoming unstable. Most learning algorithms for CNNs require very low weight update gains because of the deep depth of the network. And the other thing is, as we've heard again, deep networks tend to require a lot of training data to achieve good generalization. It's likely that systems where some of the layers are predefined and others are learned will generalize more effectively from limited training data. The regularity and the perfect reconstruction properties of the wavelets in the Scatternet mean the input image space is now fully covered all the different orientations are sort of covered by the filters and all scales, so that all types of images may be well represented by the nodes from the Scatternet layers, and they're naturally centered on the region being analyzed rather than randomly appearing with various offsets, as we tend to see when we look at first layer CNN filters. The analytic wavelets have this Hilbert pair properties, which provide some highly optimized features, such as the nearly constant magnitude with shift, and good directional selectivity from separable filters. We can create these highly oriented selectable filters because of the properties of complex exponentials when you multiply them together. The ReLU plus max pooling can be replaced by the complex modulus more efficiently. The energy is conserved through the modulus, and as long as the wavelets form a tight frame, it's also conserved, so this gives a very well-conditioned system at each layer. And finally, the wavelet transforms are usually very efficient to compute because they are separable and can use multi-rate filtering techniques. So this is just a summary of what we've said. I won't go through that. There's further papers on a lot of this stuff on my website. So thank you. Sorry I overran.
But at the end of the day, nets are used for image understanding and extracting semantics. So how would we bridge this gap?
By only using Scatternets in the early layers, and then by training the later layers to pick out the semantics. I think you'd be pushed to argue that the early layers of CNNs were actually picking out semantic information that only comes later on through the system. Effectively, where the number of nodes is starting to sort of tail down rather than expand. At the early stages, you start with the pixels and then expand out for general adding redundancy, and then you gradually tail down. It's that tailing down part where they bring in the semantic.
So you would argue that it's an advantage to swap the first couple of layers of a big net
yes.
with a Scatternet?
Yeah.
Has this been shown yet, or is still?
We're doing our best to show it, but I haven't got results that I'm prepared to show to an audience. Yes.
I have a question. So I think it's very exciting that we preserve the high resolution representation and the base is preserved, so we can go back to accurate localization. But when you look at the high frequencies, do you have a view of what kind of processing would be required? Because the high frequencies are very, very sparse features, so they are not really something that would go through a complex convolution. It really, I guess, requires a maybe different kind of processing block.
But what we're trying to do is look for patterns of high frequency sparsity, if you like. So the first layer of wavelets analyzes where the high frequencies are, and the second layer then analyzes those images of where the high frequency information is in each of the 6 orientations, and proceeds to look for patterns in those images. There's more shift in variance there than there is in the early stages. So you allow a little bit of shift in variance for the high frequencies themselves, and then you allow a bit more shift in variance for the patterns of the high frequencies, and then a bit more shift in variance for the patterns of the patterns. And so it goes on for as many Scatternet layers as you want to produce.
Yeah, I think we'd like to.
Okay.